Welcome everyone. We're just gonna give it a few minutes to let people join and then we'll get started. Hello everyone. Thank you so much for being here. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, welcome to another webinar. Today's session is what to expect when your wastewater plant is inspected. I'm joined by my colleague Avery Davis, who will facilitate the Q&A portion of today. Before we begin, we're going to go over some logistics and then we can get started. During the webinar today, everyone will be kept on mute to ensure audio quality. If you have a question, please type it into the GoToWebinar question dialog box anytime throughout the session. We will be saving your questions for a facilitated Q&A at the end of the presentation. After the webinar, you will receive a follow-up email that includes a link to the recording and other information you may need. You can also download the slides from today in the Handouts tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. This webinar has not been submitted for pre-approval of continuing education credits, but eligible attendees will receive a certificate of attendance for their personal record. To receive a certificate for this session, you must attend for the entire session and register and attend individually using your real name and unique email address. Certificates will be sent via email within 30 days of the webinar date. If you have any questions or need assistance, please contact smallsystems@syr.edu. Now for a little bit about us. The Environmental Finance Center Network provides training and technical assistance to small water and wastewater systems in all U.S. states and territories through our building technical, managerial, and finance capacity programs. If your community or utility needs assistance with drinking water or wastewater system management, please feel free to contact us through our request form, which I will be sharing shortly in the chat. And on that note, we can finally get started. I would like to introduce our presenter for today, Mike Tate from the Environmental Finance Center at Wichita State University. Welcome, Mike, and I will now go ahead and hand it over to you.
Okay, thanks again. My name is Mike Tate. I do work with the Environmental Finance Center at Wichita State. Just briefly on my background, I have about over 30 years working with the Kansas Department of Health and Environment in water and wastewater areas, and then another 6 years with EPA Region 7. And what I hope to share with you today is a little bit of my insight that I have picked up from both of those experiences, as well as some work I do now as a consultant. So with that, we'll get started. Okay. First off, a little bit of overview of what we're going to cover today, and kind of the first part is that you should know that EPA or your state regulator, whoever's authorized for the NPDES, that National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, has the authority to come in and inspect your facility. There are also non-NPDES wastewater facilities in Kansas. We have a lot of evaporative lagoons that don't discharge to a surface water. And those are state only, but they're still inspected, and states, have their own methods then for how often and what type of inspections they do on those facilities. So regardless of if you discharge in your NPDES or you don't discharge in your non-NPDES, just want you to be prepared, for an inspection. Don't want anybody to panic. I've seen people sometimes get very nervous when a regulator shows up, and you really shouldn't. Hopefully we'll talk about, understanding why that inspector's there, how the inspection plays out, know what they're looking for and why, and you can determine a little bit of that. Hopefully you have some past copies of inspections reports and or forms that you can look at to see what was gone over in the past and how that was handled. I might also say you could be a part of what's called a multimedia inspection. While you're primarily a wastewater plant, perhaps you have some hazardous waste on site, or you have a generator that may have an air pollution permit. And so somebody might do what's called a multimedia inspection and ask a few questions about one of those other areas. And if you don't feel comfortable with that, bring in staff who is. And lastly, I think it's always important for if you are operating at a plant to help the inspector understand your operation. So I guess we're going to have the first poll here now.
Yeah, so for our first poll question, we're asking, where are you employed? And the options are local government, operations or management, industry, state or federal government, consulting, or other. Gonna leave it up for about 10 to 15 more seconds. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and show those results. So it looks like 27% are in local government, 1% in industry, 43 or the bulk in state and federal government, 17% in consulting, and 11% in other.
All right, thanks. Okay, well, first off, let's start out, and everybody should know that inspections by regulators are allowed. It's covered in, what are called the federal regulations, Title 40 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 122.41I. And it says that on inspection and entry that a permittee shall allow the director or an authorized representative, generally the authorized representative, and that can even be a contractor that's hired by the agency to come onto your site and inspect your facility, following presentation of credentials. Says they can enter the premises, they can have access, and they can copy your records. They can inspect facilities, and equipment and your operations. And a part of that inspection may be taking photos and videos. They can also sample, and often will sample and monitor, the parameters that are specified in your permit, just to do a double check on your effluent. Now, it is limited to the fact that it has to be at reasonable times, which is typically workday hours. And sometimes you may have to let an inspector know if they show up at 10 or 11 that I know quite often, at least in my part of the country, hours in the workday can be 6 to 2 or 7 to 3. So you might let them know that up front as to what your typical day is, and hopefully things can be wrapped up by then. Then there's also this presentation of credentials, some kind of a badge, sometimes a business card. I would say EPA always does that. They're really required to in the regulations. States, I think it's mixed, simply because the state inspector is often out there a lot more often than you would see an EPA inspector. And you probably know them. Hopefully you know them if you've got a good working relationship with the state. But regardless, you can require credentials to be presented if you so choose. Now, the goal of the inspection for any inspector, whether they're from the state or from EPA, is really to determine your compliance with the permit conditions. And one thing I always say, don't forget, people tend to focus so much on the first part of the permit, which has effluent monitoring limits, and think that that's kind of it. That's the end of the permit. Well, that's the kind of thing you look at every month typically, and you report on. But there are also other parts of your permits which you should understand, which can be general conditions and standard conditions. Things you'll hear people call boilerplate, that's normally at the back of the permit. It's thrown on every permit, but you are responsible for it. And that's the things like keeping all of your equipment operational and reporting bypasses and spills and the likes. So make sure, even though it may be a bunch of pages of something that looks like standard text, you know what is covered in that. They're also looking to verify the information that was submitted by the permittee, you know, in their application as to what units are on site, what types of things are you treating, et cetera. So they're going to verify that. They're going to look at your sampling and monitoring. You've got pretty specific monitoring requirements in your permit, particularly if you're doing composite sampling. They're going to look to see that you got a compositor and that's being done correctly. Going to look at your lab if you do on-site lab and see how you're doing those tests, et cetera. They may also be gathering evidence to support an enforcement action. If for some reason they showed up because of an event, something that happened, they may want to look. They may feel like there needs to be some type of enforcement and they need to collect information for that. And then they're going to also assess compliance with orders and decree, schedules of compliance. A lot of people will have a schedule of compliance in a permit, or they'll get that schedule of compliance in an administrative order that comes from the regulatory authority, and they may just be trying to assess and see if you have met the dates and the requirements of that particular order. So the thing that you know, I always often heard is, well, why did you choose me? You know, why is it me? Well, I would tell you, for state regulators, you're generally going to see them at your facility probably once every 1 to 5 years. They have some obligations with EPA. They have agreements with EPA as to the fact that they will inspect facilities. Some are, you know, 20% a year, some more, what have you. So probably you're going to see that state inspector out there, like I say, every 1 to 5 years. More complex facilities that could be more of an issue if they had problems could be inspected more often. And the kind of issues that would prompt more frequent inspections than just a regularly routine inspection of your facility is if there's an upset at your facility. If you know you've reported that to the state, if there's a complaint about your facility, they may come out and do an inspection. And I say on the, you know, the upsets and the like, if that particularly gets some press, you know, newspaper, TV, you can really count on maybe somebody coming out to find out what's going on. If you're out of compliance with your discharge monitoring reports, and I would say particularly when you fill out those discharge monitoring reports, and it usually asks you for a reason as to why you had non-compliance, and if you say, I don't know why, then, you know, perhaps the inspector is going to come out and try to help you figure out why you were having a series of non-compliance issues. If you have excessive sanitary sewer overflows, you know, that's sewage that's burping out of manholes or pump stations, getting a lot of those. You may want to come look at that. If you're reporting frequent operational problems, that's another trigger to have somebody come out. And then, of course, again, the verification of your progress on a schedule of compliance. Are you getting those things done that you are required to do? So generally, for EPA, it's a little different. That was kind of tends to be why state regulators come out. EPA tends to target facilities more based on certain characteristics, like, again, a significant number of bypasses and SSOs, a facility that's in significant non-compliance. As you report that discharge monitoring report data, if you have a series of exceedances, if you have a lot of them, or if you have a few of them that are high, that are over a threshold, you're in significant non-compliance, that can certainly trigger an inspection. Upset spills and bypasses, again, I say, particularly if they've been in the press, those gather attention, and that might get you on the list for being inspected. So we had a very few people from industry here, but sometimes specific industries are targeted. There may be an emphasis in a particular year to focus on a facility before I have seen there be an emphasis on petroleum refineries for a year, that those were looked at. So most of the petroleum refineries got looked at that year. So those are kind of some of the reasons. There may be a request from a state agency to EPA to have them do an inspection for them. That can typically happen if there is maybe a concern with criminal issues. That happens very, very infrequently. But if it does, do know that EPA does have criminal investigators, and those people are agents. They carry guns and badges, and you really hope you're not inspected for criminal matters. And like I say, that happens very, very infrequently, but it could happen. And so why does EPA then tend to target maybe a little more and look at these things that have caused problems in the past? They need to make the most of their resources. They've got a handful of people in a regional office that are going to do an inspection. They have several states to cover. They may have several thousand facilities. So they want to make the most of their resources when they go out and do those. Now, these are my observations, and I hope not to upset anyone with what I say, but my experience is kind of how a state inspection flows as opposed to maybe how an EPA inspection would flow. State, I would say the inspectors are generally more informal, and that's because you see them hopefully periodically. I hope you know your typical inspector from your plant if you've been involved in the plant operations for long, and that you see that person coming back periodically, that you're talking to them when you have issues and the like. So they're just a lot more familiar with your plant, what you're doing with you. And so their inspections may last from a few minutes if they're doing a follow-up and just dropping by if they're in the area, to could be a day long. But I would tell you that excuse me, states generally have a lot more inspections that they're responsible for. When I was with Kansas, I would say that each inspector we had probably had to do at least 2 inspections a week, and that was wastewater. They also had drinking water facilities they had to inspect. So they're doing, 50, 60, 70 of these a year. So they've got to make them pretty quick to be able to get all of those done. States, I find more often, are announced inspections. They may call you up a day or 2 before or a week before and say, hey, we're coming out. You got the right people here. Maybe even tell you there's something targeted that they want to look at. They'll know a lot more about your plant again, because hopefully they've been there, a colleague's been there, can tell them what which plant looks like, any issues they've seen in the past, and they'll have access to all the applications and DMRs and the like. So they should know quite a bit before they ever show up, which means they don't require quite as much information or explanation. And the thing is, if they do miss something, they're probably going to be back in your area, even if it's visiting a neighbor facility within a short period of time, or they can drop back by and check something out while they're doing that. I think they tend to focus more on operations and technology and looking at how that causes permit compliance, a little more so than just a strict regulatory look. They may take compliance samples and they may not. I think it depends on the state. We didn't find it very efficient in Kansas to have inspectors take samples. We had a different group that did that. So you may or may not see samples taken by the state, whereas you might more often, I think, by EPA. And then their inspection reports, we usually tried to get out within a few weeks to the facility. EPA, on the other hand, is more of a formal type of inspection, and they may be more than one day long. They often take samples, and if they have to take composite samples, they're going to have to go out one day, set up the compositor, maybe do the inspection, come back the next day, a little more information, and to pick up the compositor and the sample and take it back. I'd say they're more likely to follow the regulations to the letter. They're probably a little more well-versed on regulation, say, than the state. And you have to understand they're like that because you're probably never going to see them again. Again, when they got thousands of inspections in a region to do, the chance that they're going to come back and see you in your lifetime, your work career at the facility is probably pretty minimal. So they've got to be very thorough with what they do, and they've got to efficiently use their time while they're there. They do have more types of inspections. You'll see them call inspections all kinds of names. This is out of the EPA inspection manual, and there's a whole slew of different named inspections with different acronyms. I think you tend to find the states more just call them inspections. You know, we're just there to inspect. And I'd say the EPA inspections tend to focus more on regulations as they apply to permit compliance. And I would say they're more likely to take samples. And because of the detailed nature of their report and the length of what they're doing, it usually takes longer to get those reports back from them than you will see from the state. So the format is typically an entrance interview where they're going to talk to you about, you know, what the inspection should entail, what they intend to do, how they're going to go about it. You will need to provide them with the requested records. We're going to talk about each of these things in more detail as we go on. And you have to provide them access to any facilities that are covered by the permit. You know, I always encourage you to accompany them as they go through their inspection. I know it takes away from what you're doing that day, but I think it's always best for an operator to be with them and explain operations so that nothing gets, you know, taken out of context at your facility. And like I say, they'll normally take pictures and videos. For the industry, I know there are a few industry people here, but the inspectors are cautioned to be careful if there's any confidential business information, some type of thing like that on your site that may be there, that they shouldn't be taking pictures or videos of that. You have to allow them to set up their sampling equipment and take samples. A lot of times that's a compositor. And then there will be an exit meeting and generally explain the findings to you and explain, you know, if there may be additional findings in a report. So let's talk about that entrance interview, okay? It's always good, I think, to have some of your plant management and operations staff attend so they both hear it. They both know what's going on, and they might each have kind of different functions in how you would respond, to the inspection. So I would always encourage both to be there if possible. And you should ask questions if you have them. And, if I were you, I would ask for a copy of an inspection checklist if they have one. That's not asking for anything untoward, shouldn't be secret. It ought to be a public record. And it kind of gives you an idea, and maybe even use it in training for future operators, as to the types of things that are being looked at, and, help you understand what they're looking at and looking for. You should, alert the inspector to any current issues. If you have a treatment unit that's down, or you've got a plant upset going on, it's good to talk about it them and explain to them from your perspective what you see is going on and what's happening. If records are kept off site, you need to let the inspectors know that and arrange to have records, delivered to the plant, or let the inspector go to another record storage facility. And that may sound funny to some people who are in large plants, thinking that, well, gosh, we got all of our records there. A lot of what we had in Kansas are some of these lagoon facilities where there's no building on site. So they'd have to go to another place, either City Hall or a public works building or someplace where the records are stored, and be able to look at the records there. Then the inspector is going to want to know from you, are there any additions, anything I should know that's new, that's different from the permit? Do you got more water coming in, the hydraulic increase? Do you have a different organic load, higher strength waste, higher BOD coming in, or inorganic, something like metals or salts that are coming in? And then any additional information that you think might be valuable for them to know. And I always think, I'll show you some examples here in a minute, of it's good to have a plant flow diagram, I think, to explain to them the plant operations. And a lot of times, maybe your SCADA display can do that for you. But just again, a lot of people will use checklists. Here's an old one we used when I was with the Kansas Department of Health and Environment. This is only 2 of 8 pages, but you can certainly ask for that and get a copy. One thing I found online that I think is pretty cool is in Arizona, they have a pre-inspection checklist. PDF fillable form that asks you, again, there's a lot of things over here on records, particularly, do you have these records here? By doing that as a pre-inspection and knowing it, that's going to help trigger you to say, boy, I better go find this, this, and this, all these things going on. So I think that's a really pretty good idea if Arizona is still utilizing that. Now, again, on explaining your plant, this is great. Plant we've been working with over in Missouri recently, have this nice artist rendition, 3D of the plant and how waste flows into these oxidation ditches and then out and into the clarifiers and into the ultraviolet. That's all good, really nice to show to people. But they also have their SCADA system that, could pop up. You could certainly show to, an inspector to help them understand the flow from the plant and how things work and what units are there and how it works. So I think anything you can do and have to help that inspector understand what's going on at that plant, what the unit processes are, and what the flow scheme is, it's a big help, big advantage. Now you're going to need, records review. And so, the most important thing, have a copy of your current permit. Be able to demonstrate that you keep a permit there so that you know what you're supposed to meet and how that works. They may want to look at staffing levels. Federal government, EPA doesn't have an operator certification requirement for wastewater. but many states do. And if they have an operator certification program, they may want to check the licenses of your operators. With so much stuff getting electronic, that may not be as important anymore. I know Kansas, and I've seen in Missouri, all have licensing systems online to where you can go check an operator's license and see if it's there. So all that kind of stuff is, I think, getting to be having paper records is going away. It'll get there at some point, probably not entirely there yet. And then most of your records, NPDES, it's spelled out in these federal regulations, have to be stored for at least 3 years. And that's things like your discharge monitoring reports, lab reports. And that can be if you have your own lab where you're reporting data on your DMRs, or you have a commercial lab. Verification, on the electronic data entry that you have to do for your reporting, bypass reports, equipment calibrations, flow meters is the big one. A lot of times you're going to be asked, so much, it's important how much flow is going through your plant to know if it's capable of handling it, that people are going to want to see. Have you calibrated your flow meters recently so that you're getting an accurate flow reading? There's equipment maintenance reports, and there's permit required reports. Again, that could be like those schedules of compliance, or you sending in the reports that you're supposed to. I think there's a federal requirement that if you don't have an action to take, you at least need to send in an update report annually. Going to look for those. And then there's biosolids reports. If you're an old guy like me, sludge reports, and those have to be kept for 5 years. Why that different from this? That's whoever wrote the rule determined that was necessary. So for me, to keep it easy, I guess I'd keep everything for at least 5 years if it were me, and then just not worry about it. And then if you have a collection system map, you can kind of show your collection system and where manholes are, pump stations are, that kind of thing. That's a help. Now, when I talk about these lab records, okay, here's one from a commercial lab. PACE is a big national lab. When you get those in, they're probably 10, 15 pages long, and they've got all of the spiked samples, test samples, what have you, this and that, but there'll also be pages of data that they report. So they may want to look at that data and see how it compares to what was reported. This is a facility working with that takes their data and puts it in a spreadsheet so they can do plots of trend data, but they get that information from, probably hard for you to see, but these handwritten sheets. Okay, so we got to go from the handwritten sheet to the computer sheet, and then we enter it into the federal system. In the case of Missouri, they enter it into the state, which uploads it to the federal database. And so you ought to have copies of all of those different places where you have entered data to check. And if there have time, you ought to check to see what's handwritten matches what's in the computer, matches what was reported. Okay, also on the records review, it's specified in federal rules, any reports that are used to complete the permit application. Some of that can be whole effluent toxicity reports. If you're what's called a major facility, rule of thumb, greater than 1 million gallons a day flow, you're required to do the whole effluent toxicity test as well as a priority pollutant analysis. Drawing a blank on the frequency during the permit cycle. I think it's 2 to 4 times perhaps, but those should be available too to look at. That's one of those reports that you had to use to complete your application to say that yes, we did that sampling. O&M manuals, people aren't going to generally go through those line by line. just going to look, see, does it exist? Are you following it? Emergency plans, good to have. What are you going to do if your plant floods? What are you going to do if you lose power at your plant? All of that kind of thing. And again, probably aren't going to give it great detail, but just look to see that you have one. And then they're going to look at your maintenance records, treatment equipment, lab equipment, etc. And if they're electronic, which so many people are going to these days, you may be able to just show them how it's recorded. They may be able to take a picture, with their phone of that screen, and that, just satisfy that. You can have very simple records for them to review. Maintenance records. This is somebody going out to a lagoon on weekdays, and just it shows that they were there. It shows that they looked at the influent, the lagoon system, and they looked at the effluent to see if there were too much solids. Anything like that just shows that you've actively, been managing your facility and checking it out. Here's an example of one of the, computer maintenance management systems that's out there that, again, you may be able to show an inspector saying, hey, this is how we track stuff. It tells us that on this week we need to do this. Generally, you can click into them somewhere and it'll show if that was done and how it was recorded. So you may want to share that with the inspector just to show that, yeah, we keep track of our stuff. We've got this piece of software that keeps track of maintenance requirements, keeps track of work orders that were sent out on, who's to maintain it and when, and that it got done. Then you're going to do the plant inspection. What they're mainly going to try to do is determine if your facility, what's there, what's operational, matches the permit description. And generally, they're going to follow that, as most of us would want to do, from the influent to the effluent. But sometimes it might make sense to go out of order. And I suggest that if you think it's appropriate. An example I've seen before is, a lot of people may only belt press solids, sludge from their process a day or two a week, and they may only do it in the mornings. If that's the case and the press is operating, you might want to ask somebody, say, hey, this is the end of the process, but do you want to view it while it's operating? And so you can start there and move on. But generally, you'll want to go head of the plant to the end of the plant. And they're going to observe, your flow monitoring points, the influent and effluent, see if you do have the monitoring devices there, the hopefully calibrated monitoring devices. They're going to want to look at your sampling points. Are they where they're supposed to be in the permit? Some permits get very detailed as to where that's located. Some are a little more open. They may say after the ultraviolet disinfection unit. So they may want to go and see that your effluent's being sampled after the ultraviolet disinfection unit or some other disinfection unit. And they're going to look at if there's composite samplers, and that's required in the permit. Do you have compositors on site? Does it look like that's how you're doing it? Are your compositors refrigerated? Do you throw ice in them to chill samples while you're taking them? Are they flow weighted or time weighted? All those types of things, just to check to make sure you're sampling correctly. Other things they're going to evaluate while they're there, and I always put at the top of the list, is housekeeping. Good housekeeping leaves a better impression of your plant with the inspector. I go into a plant and there's papers laying around everywhere, stuff stacked up, pumps pulled apart, dirty, you name it. It's going to make you question, just has to make you question in your mind if other things are being well maintained that are, say, below the water surface, things that might not be seen. So, try to make a little bit of an effort, to keep a decent appearance at your facility. I know operators get busy sometimes, and that's kind of the last thing you want to think of, but it sure gives a lot more confidence to people about the operation of your plant. They're going to look and see if you got spare parts. You know, do you have extra pumps? If you have pumps that go out periodically, seals, those types of things. You know, do you have another blower? All that, you know, particularly, you know, maybe aerators. Do you have the diffused aerators that you can replace if you have a bad one? And then probably the one that causes the most issue that I've seen is, are all your units operational? And again, this federal regulation requires that at all times properly operate and maintain facilities and systems of treatment control. I've seen people sometimes interpret that to mean that all units have to be operating all the time. That's not the intent of that rule. And I'll give you an example. I was at a plant last month that had actually 8 clarifiers, and they were only using 4 because the flows were low enough that that's all they needed. It would actually cause probably worse operation if they tried to run all 8. So you may only be running, you know, 2 or 3 at a time, maybe 4 at a time, and you just need to explain that to the inspector. And, you know, really it says as long as the permit meets limits, then, you know, you should be okay. You should be able to respond, though, that if those extra clarifiers, extra aeration basins are needed, that they could be called into service, that they will operate. So that's really what that's getting at. It doesn't say everything has to be going full bore 24/7. And if a unit's down for repair, you ought to tell the inspector the reason why it's down for repair and when it should be fixed. You know, hopefully in most cases you told the regulatory agency. If you think it's going to affect your treatment, you probably should have already called them and let them know that. An example of one I saw last month, actually this is a kind of rare peripheral flow clarifier. That's a concrete wall and that's a metal plate that runs top to bottom in it, and flow comes in behind it. You probably can't tell from your computer unless you got a big screen. There's a crack there, and that plate actually floated up. It got caught in the clarifier sweep. It broke the gear drive at the top of the clarifier. Everything shot. So we went, you know, they're able to show you that they have ordered the parts to replace the guts when they're, you know, anticipated to be installed and when it'll be functioning again. So sometimes you can't help it, but it's good to be able to demonstrate that you know it, you're replacing it, and you have an estimated date that it's going to be operational again. Another thing in terms of operations of your plant, again, get back to the SCADA that could be helpful. You might be able to show that different units are operating within an oxidation ditch. These are mixers and these are rotors. If you're familiar with treatment, I won't get in and explain all of that, but you know, that can also be good to help show that, you know, why they're running like that, why you don't have them all on. And in this case, these are controlled by a dissolved oxygen probe. As the dissolved oxygen goes down, more rotors are called on. As it goes up, they may be shut off. But, you know, I think as you so often see in the clickbait on the web, pro tips. Well, here's a pro tip I will give you, is to be sure to explain to the inspector what each color means. You know, I normally think green is on. In this case, red is on. So be sure and tell them that red is on, because they could go to the next facility that they've seen and in it, green is on. Okay. So I think SCADA is a great way to show people, you know, what's going on in your plant, what's operating, how it works. Just be sure to, again, help coach and help the inspector understand what that SCADA, if you don't know, SCADA, System Control Data Acquisition System, is showing them. So other things they're going to evaluate is what type of sampling is done for operational control. Again, we've talked about that discharge monitoring report, the compliance samples. We're also hoping that a lot of these facilities will do some operational control. Like somebody may ask you, okay, what's your mixed liquor suspended solids if you got an activated sludge plant? That's an operational control parameter. They might ask what it is. Hopefully, you know, and might ask you how you sample that. So just be able to explain what you use for operational control at your facility. They're also going to be doing a lot of visual observations. Excuse me. Clarifier arms are moving. Aerations even. Yeah, that's a dead giveaway on so many activated sludge plants. If you have a dead zone, or if you have, is that a plant that had these huge bubbles coming up in one area and finer bubbles in another, they had a bad aerator, aeration disc that they needed to replace, and they're going to ask about that. Just typical things: color of your activated sludge or the fixed film if you get a fixed film type process. Scum and foam that's present. What color is it? Is it heavy? Is it light? Is it bubbly? Odors. Dead giveaway. If you get bad odors, that something might be going on. Disinfection may be as simple. Hopefully they can look at the control panel and see, that the lights are on and what their transmittance is, but you can also just visually see that if they're on. And solids handling, look at that type of stuff too. The other thing they're going to evaluate on site is to see if you have had any spills on site, and that's typically evidenced by dried solids, sitting on the ground. They've dried up. Standing water, sewage, black water that's smelly. Is there backup power available? Probably going to ask you, if you do have a backup generator at your plant, do you exercise it? And by exercising, we just mean that periodically, monthly, every couple of months, you're kicking that generator on to make sure it runs, make sure that it kicks in when you lose power. Going to ask probably to go to the outfall, and I hope tell every operator this, and a lot of them tend not to do it, is to go to the outfall. I'd like to see it daily, but maybe you can't get there that often, but at least weekly, and look at the outfall and see, if there's, colored, odd colors, if there's solids and smells. Again, may be hard for you to see on your monitors, but here's a big buildup of sludge below this outfall point here. And it's you've all probably seen when you've got some high organic strength water, that gray, greenish gray, yucky looking water there, that implies you probably, eaten up a lot of the dissolved oxygen. That's really embarrassing if you haven't been down to the outfall and you go down with the inspector and you find that there and it catches you by surprise. That's never a good thing. Then if you have a laboratory on site, they're going to want to look at that. Most likely look at your test procedures. Are they EPA approved? Most people are probably buying stuff from Hawk or Hanna or one of the other companies that has the spectrophotometer type analyses, and they will tell you right on the boxes the chemicals you get, whether or not it's an EPA approved method. Most generally they are. They want to look at maintenance records in the lab. Are you calibrating things right? Just something as simple as a pH meter. How often are you dipping it in your standards to calibrate your meter? If a state has a lab certification program, are you certified? And the like. And then want to look at compliance with any state regulations.
Hey, Mike, we just got a
yeah.
question in.
Okay.
So they just asked in regards to the slide that had the picture of the outfall. How does that, let me see, if the outfall looks like the example just shown, how does that get corrected and reported to EPA?
There's couple of ways. First off, you got to figure out the source of it. Why is it happening? Do you know if you've lost solids from that treatment plant? If something happened, you had an upset. A lot of times people will, if they get that bad, get a fire hose or some kind of high pressure hose and try to break up the solids and try to wash that downstream. And that might have a short-term impact of chlorine in the water and all, but it's probably better to bust that up and get it moving downstream and hopefully get that spot to recover.
Great, thank you.
Most wastewater treatment plants are covered under the stormwater rules. They're big enough, and so they're going to look for some of the stormwater issues. Spills, oil sheens, debris that are around there. You're doing best management practices to keep stormwater from coming in contact with pollutants, like if you're storing biosolids that have been dried or, they under roof or covered somehow so they're not getting washed off by a storm. Secondary containment on storage tanks. A lot of plants now use chemicals for various reasons, if it's polymers or ferrous, to get stuff to settle, what have you. That's there. Are you adequately routing stormwater around the property, et cetera? And are you maintaining the records that are required from the stormwater piece? And lastly, if people have heard me talk before, I love ponds. I think they do a great job for small communities. So just a little bit about what's going on there. You say, gosh, you've talked about all this complex stuff at these activated sludge plants. What about my little old lagoon that just cooks along out and doesn't need anything? Well, it does. And if I'm an inspector out there looking at that, I'm first off going to look and see if you have freeboard. That means the distance from the water to the top of the dikes is where it should be. I'm going to look and see if the water level in the lagoons is even. If it's not, that means you probably got a plug transfer pipe between one cell and another that's causing it to build up. I want to see if you got a clean influent structure and if it's splitting flow correctly between the cells. I like to see those transfer pipe screened so that things don't get in them and plug up and cause your flow to have be restricted and cause different levels in the ponds. Dikes, good integrity. Here's a picture of bad integrity. Somebody's dike fell out the back, basically. It wasn't well maintained. They threw a bunch of rock in, but that's going to have to be fixed. Everybody talks about, are they mowed? This one certainly isn't mowed very well. And here's an example of one. This was one you can see all around this lagoon, terrible overgrowth. But you see this area here, well, they had hired a licensed pesticide applicator who came out and put a pretty high strength pesticide on, and by the time he cleared out the brush, you could see the rock riprap there like it should have been. Said, well, they're going to do that to the rest of the lagoon. Their mower had broken and they hadn't got it fixed. And when you look at that kind of growth, you figure it must have been broken for a few years to get that kind of overgrowth. Look and see if you got animal burrowing in those, if your liners are in good shape, if you got a plastic liner, if it's intact at the top of the dike. May look at short circuiting. Guy Steve Harris. Steve's kind of the guru of lagoons. Steve's run across some health issues and wish him the best, but he always used to say, easiest thing for short circuiting, take a few oranges with you and throw out in the lagoon and see if the water flows out all over the surface of the lagoon or if it flows right from the influent to the next transfer pipe. And that tells you there's short circuiting there. And then you should look at the effluent. Is it green and solid? You can't hardly help that it's green in the summer when you got it, but if you get excess solids, a lot of times those of you who run lagoons know that you can draw off water at different depths in that lagoon. So if you're getting a lot of solids, you might need to change the draw off point. Kind of then the last thing you do is you wrap up with an exit meeting, and that should give the final impressions of what the operator or the inspector saw. They should tell you any noncompliance they observe, but again, they may not be able to tell you all the noncompliance they saw. They may have to go back and check to see if something was done that shouldn't have been. So you might get something else in a written report than what you heard during the inspection. And if it's serious enough, some of them can issue what's called a notice of violation, letter of violation on the spot to tell you to stop, correct an action, right away before they can get the letter out even. So hopefully there's nothing that needs that kind of urgent attention, but maybe. And then there's items that, just may need improvement. What I call more suggestions or recommendations, like if you had a lot of stringy algae hanging on your clarifier weirs, they may not like the looks of that, and it doesn't look good, and it probably ultimately will cause a problem, but that's more of a recommendation. There's no federal rule that tells you gotta clean your weirs, but it's good practice anyway. They may tell you if you couldn't provide them some information they needed, they might ask you to do it by a date, within a week, within a few days. Provide them some information that you didn't have on site, you couldn't provide at that time. And then any questions you might have. And again, always best to clarify what was really non-compliance and what was recommendations. And then the inspector's next step is going to be, hopefully just send you an inspection report, and it may have some things in it for you to do or correct. If they feel like there were significant enough violations there, they might send you a notice of violation or a letter of violation. And they might tell you if they think a follow-up inspection is warranted and that they might be back out in a month or 2 months to look and see that you've corrected those things that they've identified. So what you want to do is carefully review the report, provide any additional information they've requested, identify what's a requirement and recommendation. You got to address the requirements. The recommendations are kind of up to you, but you better have a good rationale if you choose not to follow up on those recommendations. And if clear errors exist in the report, respond in writing. If they say, oh, a unit was broken, say, no, we just weren't operating it, that type of thing you can clear up. If there's kind of a difference in opinion and it's not real serious and not going to affect anything you have to do, sometimes it's best to just let it go and move on and say, okay, with that. So next poll.
Great. So we're going to test folks' knowledge a little bit. So for our last poll, what is the records storage requirement? And your answer options are forever, 5 years in most cases, 3 years in most cases, or until your next inspection. Looks like about 74% have responded, so we'll give it a few more seconds. All right, I'll go ahead and close the poll, and I will share those results. The leading answer at 49% is 3 years in most cases. The following answer is 43% with 5 years in most cases. Third, we have forever at 7%. And finally, until your next inspection at 1%.
Okay. All right. Well, I probably was a little bit confusing on that because 3 years is the actual for most records. That's what's required in the federal regulations. But if you said 5, that's for the biosolids records, and my recommendation that everything just be stored 5 so you don't get caught off guard. I think it's easier to remember 5 years for everything. So good for you guys. You got all that. So lastly, my tips for inspections. Don't panic or be confrontational. Treat it like a conversation with the inspector. Both of you should want the same thing, which is to produce a good effluent that meets permit limits and protects water quality. Make sure you understand the requirements of your permit, so that if you get asked something, you know that you're on top of it and you know everything you're required to do and can demonstrate that. Be able to produce all those records. We talked, there's a lot of them, but be able to produce them. Know the operational status of your treatment units. Again, that, you go out and something's not working. Is it really broken, or is it just not being used because it's not needed? And then be able to explain your plant operation. I think that's just a huge plus. And if you got some kind of flow diagram, pictures, aerial shot that you can show the plant, I think that really helps people understand, and understanding is a big part of doing an inspection. And goes without saying, be honest with the inspector. There's no point in trying to hide anything that's there. The worst can be is, that you're going to get some kind of a violation, maybe some kind of an order, but, be honest about it. Tell the inspector where the problems are. You can discuss them and figure out how to address them. And then lastly, I say if you can't sleep at night, EPA has what's called their compliance inspection manual that's online, a mere 900 pages. And so, yeah, if you want to know how they go about it, how they train their inspectors to do inspections and know more detail, you can call that up and put yourself to sleep at night reading that. And with that, that's what I have, unless there's some questions.
I'm not seeing any questions roll in, but I encourage folks, if they do come up after the session, to reach out to Mike via the email on the screen, or to reach out to us directly via smallsystems@syr.edu, and we can forward along your questions. And on that note, I will hand it back to my colleague Callista to close us out. Thanks so much, Mike.
You bet.
Hi again. A huge thank you to Mike Tate for sharing his experience with us today. Following the webinar, you will receive a follow-up email with the slides from today and a link to the recording. We also ask that you complete the webinar evaluation form, or evaluation following the webinar. You can let us know your thoughts on today's session, as this helps us plan for future webinars on topics important to you. Thank you again, and we hope to see you at future EFCN events.